Okay, awesome. Um, so I'm just going to welcome you to the show, and then we're just going to start to chat. Is
All
that
right.
okay?
Yeah. Take me wherever you want to go and cut
Okay.
me off whenever you need to.
Okay. Um, I'll wait a few beats. Steve, welcome to the show. I'm so excited that you've taken the time today to be here.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to talk to you. Happy to talk to anybody that shares a passion for sound and the way it works in the world.
Yes, for sure, and that's why I'm so excited to talk to you. We come from two very different worlds, but similar worlds in a way. Like it's all about um, in motivating. For me, it was in advertising, and it was in direct response advertising, and I got involved with original compositions and sound design without even knowing that it was something that people kind of don't think as a forethought,
Hmm.
right? When they're creating, I don't think they do now. Years later, it's been 28 years later, but I really, if I could put it into a nutshell, I would say that they don't think about it beforehand, and they should be thinking about it possibly beforehand. Can you hear that airplane flying over my?
Uh, I did, but in the time of COVID, everybody knows. That's that's just part of the sonic intimacy
Exactly,
that we all
exactly,
share.
exactly. Now you're feeling where I am,
It
right?
keeps it real.
It does. Well, it's a little obnoxious for me, but it is real for the audience, and it's a great, like I know it's there, everybody. Um, but uh, music, sound design for me was something that we worked on such limited budgets that we had to, in direct response advertising, long form infomercials, short form commercials, we were all about the limited budget and having the performance. And so we didn't always have the luxury of having, licensing music, or you could cut to it. But at the end of the day, you're now designing, composing music because of budgetary reasons. So I got thrown into this whole world of sound design and music that for not a creative reason, but for a
Mhm.
budget reason, right? And then
Sure.
that's how I developed my knowledge and my experience in doing, original compositions and stuff like that for
Hmm.
advertising. And you really feel as though, and rightfully so, um, it has a lot to do with getting the consumer to take action.
Yeah, I think to your point, I often, when I'm talking to clients or in presentations about sound, I have a series of observations to begin the conversation. And the
Yeah.
first observation is that sound moves us. That's the thing we all know, because if we think about our lives, it's soundtracked.
Right.
There might be a sound from childhood that we remember that every time we hear it again, it takes us right back there. For me, it's the sound of a train whistle. I grew up in West Virginia in a coal mining town, and you'd hear the trains early in the morning. And so that takes me right back there. Or
Yeah.
a song that, uh, that marks that first romance, or maybe a
Oh, yeah.
breakup, or
Oh,
some other
yeah.
significant part in our lives. So there's no question about that. And advertisers and marketers lean into sound, and particularly music, because we all instinctively know there's power there. But for that knowledge, to your point, it's typically an afterthought.
Right.
As you said, things are mapped out. We kind of think about the messaging, how we're going to work on the campaign, and then we get to a point where it's like, oh, I've got a script. I guess I need a voiceover. Somebody needs to read it.
Right.
Oh, yeah, maybe we need a piece of music behind it. And so these decisions are often made last minute. They're often, to your point, they're budget driven, but I think that there are some great options that can fit within budgets. The real problem is there's not a lot of thought or time given
That
to
goes
it.
into it.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So, from a perspective of, at C Spot Run, which is my company, I was such a small collective of freelancers, really, and I'm like the center of, of the heartbeat of it. So I would always look at things if I was hired to write and produce a commercial, I always, and I didn't even know I was doing this, by the way, Steve. You know, I'm a Pisces, I'm a creative. I never once, I didn't take a marketing 101, nothing, but I've been very successful for 30 years, right? Taught myself everything I know about production, everything I know about anything. I taught myself about it, right? But I would always hear it in my head. I would hear the
Hmm.
script in my head. I would hear when I did Walter Cronkite, I was for CBS and Timeless Media, and I knew that I had to fit Walter Cronkite's entire career into maximum 2 minutes, more than likely 60 seconds, right? And I
Right.
knew the footage I had to work with. I had that, but what did I hear? How did it move, right?
Hmm.
How was I going to write this script in reverse, right? I've got the footage. Now I have to write the script, but what am I hearing it feel like as somebody's watching it, right?
Right.
What does
Hmm.
Walter Cronkite feel like,
Right.
his life? And that was always for me. Um, I think what I'm trying to say is I always put the sound of things first
Hmm.
and then develop around it, right?
Right.
I think that
Yeah.
helps in editing. It helps with in the eventually with the composition,
Hmm.
right? And um, and then it just helps, I guess. And then anyway. Sorry, I think about that and I get really melancholy because it's such a beautiful thing to really work on an expression of somebody's life and then design the sound to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Well, it's to your point, um, it is about feeling. I mean, we know that music and sound has a way to evoke memories, and emotions in a really powerful way. Our sense of smell is actually probably the most powerful memory trigger,
Yeah,
um, but it gets associated early on in our lives with things that are pleasant and unpleasant.
right.
And once we make those associations, it's difficult to change that.
Mm-hmm.
But sonically, our worlds change and evolve, and we create new associations, or some associations are changed in other ways. And it's such a powerful tool that if you are wanting to strike, a particular emotion, a mood, tie into something that helps you interpret a narrative. That's where the power is. And so often in marketing, we tend to uh, be monosensorial. We tend to think about only one of the senses,
Right,
and very often it's the visual.
right.
Most brands and marketers will put most time and effort and energy into the visual side, without really recognizing the power of sound. And the other piece of that is that we make sense literally of the world around us with all the sensory input.
Mm-hmm.
So we should be thinking about all of them together. It shouldn't be, here's my visuals, here's my sound, here's my scent or my touch or my taste, if those are, part
Right.
of the brand experience. It's how do all of those things work together? And there's a lot of rich science around how sound does impact our perception of reality and our behavior as a result of that.
So at it's Resonate, right?
Studio Resonate at
Studio
Pandora.
Resonate
Hmm.
at Pandora. Um, how I watch yesterday I went online and I watched I love the little thing that you guys have where it talks about the different, I think one was connection, one was
Yeah,
storytelling.
the six dimensions of sound.
Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that. I love that visually, and love how it's recorded. It's such
Hmm.
a great job, and it's concise. It's short. I happen to like
Yes.
short. I don't like long. I also
Right.
experienced yesterday Joe Rogan for 3 hours, first time in my life, and I will never go back. Right? Because it was 3 hours of it was too long. Anyway, but I love the way that you pull out if anybody wants to go there.
Hmm.
Is it Pandora.com or is it
You
StudioResonate.com?
can go to studioresonate.com, and it'll take you there where you can
Yeah.
find the
And
experience. Yeah.
everybody kind of introduces themselves, the people that
Yeah.
work there, the creative
Yeah.
director, the this. I really enjoyed that. I
Hmm.
wanted to tell you that.
Thank you.
Um, that from it, I my other well, no, this is this podcast. I interviewed not too long ago Daniel Plotkin, and Daniel Plotkin is a geriatric psychiatrist, and he has this worry. He's with UCLA. He's very well known in what he's doing, and he has this thing about there not being enough geriatric psychiatrists for the aging population. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and I know, well, I believe I'm trying to help him in a way, but I love the way that healthcare is intersecting with sound and sound design,
Mm-hmm.
and how I think COVID has brought a big awareness to how sound through meditation, through calming, calm, all of these things really like kind of like exploded because it's a medium that can, I believe, can be easily accessed, and yet it's so incredibly therapeutic. And you do a lot of work in those sectors, correct?
Yes, yeah, and healthcare is a particular passion of mine. I think there's been all kinds of research into the power of sound in terms of patient satisfaction and outcomes. In fact, Charles Spence, who heads up the Cross-Modal Research Laboratory at Oxford,
Mm-hmm.
um, Charles and I did a paper that appeared in the Journal of Music and Medicine last fall that was essentially a large literature review of all of these areas where sound has potential to have an impact in healthcare
Right,
environments,
right,
and basically made the argument that as healthcare and hospitality has intersected, and there's a lot more emphasis on looking at patients as consumers, and moving away from just thinking about treating the disease to looking at the patient experience as
right.
part of all of that.
Exactly.
And so sound plays an important role. The unfortunate thing is that for all of the research, there are just relatively few places that have done a good job of bringing these things together and connecting the dots.
Yeah.
So they may have one little piece here, one little piece there, and then you have regulatory issues. Music therapy is something that's been around for
Yeah.
years, but there's only a handful of states where you can be licensed. And why that is important is, if you want music therapy as a treatment and you need
Right.
insurance to take care of it,
Right. Oh my God,
if
this
it,
is exactly what
if
Daniel
it
talks about.
yeah, if it's not licensed, then you have a problem. And Ben Folds, the artist, that's a particular passion of his, and he's been a real advocate in trying to bring the awareness of the power of music therapy, and the need for there to be more certification and licensing, to where it can be more accessible to anyone and everyone. So we could talk for hours about the impact on health. Everything from not just what you think about in terms of relaxation,
Right.
or taking a look at the sound of alarms and what happens with alarm fatigue, or
Mm-hmm.
kind of creating
Mm-hmm.
a post-traumatic stress
Yeah,
experience.
exactly.
We can go into the impact of sound on diet, how we could change your perception of sweetness using what we're putting in your ears and not just what we're putting in your mouth. So, kind of offsetting things for diabetic, for individuals who have chronic treatment, cancer,
Yeah.
chemotherapy,
Yeah.
that sometimes has an effect on
Yeah.
taste and flavor.
Oh my
You know,
God,
can,
all the
can we
time.
can we
Mm-hmm.
hack senses with sound and bring some of that back? Can we increase caloric intake based on sonic cues, things we're putting into the environment? There's so much that can be done here.
What's the biggest obstacle? What is it that makes people not understand the beautiful magic of sound?
Well, again, there's there's what I call this value perception gap that kind of gets to what I spoke about earlier, in terms of, on the one hand, we intrinsically understand the power, but then on the other hand, when we're trying to work out the benefits, the return on investment, what is that? And so there's this gap that exists between
So it
our
can't be
belief
it can't be
in the power of
measured.
sound
Yeah.
and our behavior.
Yeah.
And the reality is that we actually can measure it,
Hmm.
but sometimes we don't take the time to do it, or we're just not thinking that we have a lot more sophisticated measurement tools. I
Is it
think the biggest, to answer your question, I think the biggest problem in healthcare is, again, kind of looking at some of these regulatory issues. Uh, and then I think some of it is just um, lack of imagination. The science is there, but, reimagining the healthcare experience, that really takes um, a cultural shift, if you
right?
will. And our healthcare system is quite honestly so broken in so many ways that there's not the cultural sensitivity or the awareness that a soundscape can be just as important to someone's health and well-being as pharmacology.
Do you think that possibly COVID, a positive of COVID, because I agree with you, a cultural shift is a massive thing to happen, right? And it doesn't happen like overnight, a cultural shift.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it appears that it's becoming more and more accepted that 5 minute meditations, 10 minute meditations, listening to rain, whatever, um, is is becoming more accepted for the younger generations, and so that shift probably is going to be, it has started possibly because it takes a movement to make a
Yeah,
cultural shift, and then it doesn't. But I think it's organically started because of people seeking ways to feel better about themselves.
yeah. I think part of that is, to your point, I think it's cultural. I do think, you know, younger generations, whether you want to give them a name like Gen Z, that have a different relationship with technology,
Yeah.
and so they're used to using technology in ways that really is about maintenance. Maintaining mood, maintaining a state of mind. I think there's more openness there. Um, I think, though, that part of the universal problem is that we still are not entrained to listen. Listening is really a skill, and particularly if you want to practice active listening. So,
Hmm.
listening with intention um, is part of where the benefit can come into play. And in some ways, we're listening less intentionally. An example I would give would be if you just think about the evolution of music, where back in the day when it was a vinyl record,
Yeah, you
you
put the
know,
record
you
on,
yes, it was a
yeah, with
multi-sensory
an
experience. You
intention.
would take it out of the
Yeah,
the album, the smell of the
yeah,
records, you'd put it on,
yeah.
you'd invite friends over, you had to listen to particular tracks, you would, experience that as a social
Yeah,
exercise. And now we've kind of evolved to a point where everyone has a celestial jukebox in the sky.
yeah,
So anything you want, you can listen to, anywhere you want. And that's not to say that there aren't new social rituals that have risen around listening to music, but we've moved away from listening to music with an intentional sense of, a
right.
particular song, as much as it now becomes situational. Well, I have a playlist for when I'm working. I have a playlist for when I'm
Yeah,
relaxing. And again, that's not a pejorative. I think those are good things. It's about mood regulation and management. But there is a way in which we maybe have lost touch with some of the other ways that more intentional listening can benefit us. And that's certainly not just about music, it's about the sound of our voice, it's about soundscapes in the world around us.
yeah,
And I think you were talking about COVID. I think the challenge with COVID is it's thrust us into um, a world, particularly early on, that just sounded different. The soundscapes around us were changing. We were no longer, you know, in offices where we had that, we were, working more out of home. Those of us who have partners or children, there's that shifts the soundscape in the home.
I
How do you
have
manage?
airplanes.
Yes, exactly. How do we manage all of that?
Yeah.
And some, some of us are paying attention to that. There's some research that's being done in these shifts, but there are other things not just around COVID. Think about Black Lives Matter. I mean, we could talk again for hours
Right.
around the idea that systemic racism isn't just seen, it can also be heard.
Yeah.
So how is our listening ear trained to
Right.
listen for tropes, for stereotypes? How does that affect how we see ourselves,
Do you, do
in our own
you
voices?
at Studio Resonate, do you ever do like a testing, like what the visceral reactions to video only, like B-roll, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same B-roll but with sound, like testing how people actually react. Because when you think about the simplicity of it is watch the same thing that's a commercial without the sound, and you obviously aren't even going to turn your head and know it's on, right? I mean, the simplest little things. One time, I was launching a product for a company, and in direct response television, it was always you wait until the end, you build the offer, and you wait until the end to reveal the offer, right? You guys talk about this at Studio Resonate, and and I said to myself, oh, why the hell do I have to do that, right? So I wrote the script, and I said, if you could look perfect or something like this, flawless. If you could look the VO, if you could look flawless for only 19.99, would you? Right? And then of course you would, right? And then the commercial played. And that having the offer at the top of the show and not making people wait until the end was one of
Mm-hmm.
the smartest things I'd ever did. And my entire industry said, you're crazy. What did you do that for? Well, of course it worked very well, right?
Yeah.
Um, but my idea in doing that wasn't so much about the offer. It was, how do I get somebody to turn their head and look at the television screen and listen? And
Right.
and that's how I did it. And that's
Well,
why
and I think what you're tapping into there is this idea of sonic strategy.
hmm
That's my title at Studio Resonate, as
that's
Sonic
right.
Strategy Director. And the simplest way that I define sonic strategy is it's blending sound science with sound art to help our clients make sound decisions. And so you're looking at this problem. How do I make people pay attention?
Right.
And the solution, strategically was, well, what if I put this offer or this call to action at the beginning of the
Right.
spot rather than the end?
That's right.
So that's a piece of it. And to your earlier question about research and testing, yes, even though Pandora's platform is for the most part audio only or audio first, um, because sound
I saw
doesn't
I
happen
saw
in a vacuum.
I saw
There
a
are
commercial. I saw a
Yes,
commercial today on
there are
Pandora.
videos that
Yeah.
we have, but as I said, for the most part,
Yeah.
it's audio first and audio only. That tends to be where a lot of the research is focused. But I've done research around the impact of sound on visuals, partly drawn from some of my research into something I call audio archetypes.
hmm
So, we were talking earlier about emotion. That's
Right.
where we think about music and emotion. Um, I started to think about, well, what if music doesn't just communicate emotion? What if it actually communicates meaning? What if there are ways that, just as we have visual symbols that kind of trigger ideas and context,
Right.
are there auditory symbols that could do the same? And so we did some research, and basically the short outcome of the research was that we found that if we talk to composers about archetypal narratives, like a lover or a jester or a rebel or a sage, and ask them, what are the sonic elements that they would use to put together to create a musical narrative to interpret this
Yeah.
archetype. we found that a lot of the composers that we tested drew from the same well. We didn't really get into the why. We just wanted to see if it was happening. And then we found that everyday consumers, listeners, could decode these symbols in the same way. So I did a piece of research working with a neuromarketing company in Central America, where we took a commercial and we scored it with different pieces of music designed to get at these different archetypes. So we tracked, we did eye tracking, where we watched what they were
Yeah.
looking at, and how long they were looking at things in certain areas. We also wired them up so we could see brain waves, we
Yeah.
could measure cognitive load, we could measure arousal and heart rate, and kind of look at appeal. And what we found was, simply by changing the soundtrack that we were using, we changed what they looked at, how long they were looking, how hard their brain was working to make sense of everything. And we found that the soundtrack that was congruent archetypally with what they were seeing um, performed the best, as we expected that it would. So in that context, then, now you're starting to think about, okay, it's not just about emotion, it's about narrative. And then what are other tricks that we can put in,
Right.
like Honda has done with they have a two-note audio logo, but if you notice, you always hear it at the beginning of the spots. It's not at the end. you know Part of that was driven by just thinking about, okay, online people very often are skipping things.
That's
They'll
right.
hear the beginning and they'll move on.
Uh-huh.
So how do we at least give them a quick brand impression? And so initially that was the decision, but when they tested it, they realized that, at least in that instance, it also primed listeners for the content.
Hmm.
So they had more attention as a result. So that was an added benefit. And they have adapted that pretty consistently across all their advertising. I don't necessarily think it works for everyone,
Yeah.
but I do think that that's an important consideration.
I like the so we're talking right now, if people aren't getting it, we're talking about sonic branding, basically. Sonic
Mm-hmm.
logos and, your sound as a brand. What does your
Right.
brand sound like? What does your
Mm-hmm.
brand feel like? What does it want to do? And what does it sound like? Right?
Yeah.
What's your the sound of your brand culture? And um, I love I love all of that. Uh, some of the most famous ones, so we'll just fill people in. And you do them really well. Would you do them for me? Do the Netflix, do them, okay? Could you
Well,
do
I mean,
that?
there's so many, but the
Just to give an
ones that are,
example for
yeah,
listeners.
the ones that are most recognizable for most folks might be the what we call the Intel bong, the bum 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 bum,
Right.
or McDonald's, the ba da bum bum ba, or T-Mobile is another one that's very recognizable, ba 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 ba.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
Netflix.
there are all these. Yeah,
H.
Netflix is just the kind of a two note,
Boom.
put together with a few things.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a tie-in with those two notes to, if you ever saw House of Cards, when the character Frank Underwood would make a point, he would knock his ring two times on a
Oh,
desk or a piece of wood, and they
oh,
actually used that sound design
I was going to ask
at
you.
the end of one of the seasons. When he got into the White House and
Uh-huh.
he pounded his ring two times on the
Right. They
desk, you very
amplified it.
clearly
Yeah.
heard
Hmm.
the Sonic logo there.
Oh,
So
that's
yeah,
cool.
Netflix is one we are familiar with because we hear it all the time when we watch something.
Yeah, I mean, everybody can imagine turn on Netflix and then and not hear that Sonic logo. You would go, wait, something's wrong, right?
Yes.
And you start to recognize them. Well, we all recognize them, but when you start to talk about the fact that they're Sonic logos, more
Mhm.
people that are learning about Sonic logos in the advertising space and marketing, you start to notice them more, that they are around. I do really like the idea, and I think MasterCard is doing it,
Hmm.
where when you swipe your card, you know that the transaction went
Right.
through and it's MasterCard, right? Because
Yeah.
there's going to be, instead of whatever it is now when you're swiping your card in the various places,
Right.
they'll have their own little sonic logo that will assure you that your transaction has been done by through your MasterCard.
Right. Yeah. And those things we call those, functional sounds. Um, because there's an element that's designed to be functional. Uh, there are other brands and products that use those. You turn something on, you turn something off. There's an alarm. There's some kind of alert notification.
Yeah,
There's a whole set of these functional sounds, and I think what's important in this aspect is very often when brands think about sonic identity, again, they typically they'll jump to the tactic without thinking about the strategy. So it's, oh, I need to get one of those sonic logos, or I need a functional sound, or I need a brand theme, or
hmm
a jingle.
hmm
But when you focus on those assets, you lose sight of the fact that sonic identity is not simply about a single asset. It's
hmm
about a combination of assets
hmm
in a system that allows for a lot of flexibility.
hmm
And so, to your point with MasterCard, they have a longer brand theme. They have a shorter sonic logo. They have a set of functional sounds that are used. This gives them the ability to show up in a lot of different audio contexts on a consumer journey. And I'm very often comparing sonic identity systems with visual identity
Right,
systems
right,
because they are very similar. We
right.
have visual logos. So a
Exactly.
sonic logo is to the ear what a visual logo is to the
Right,
eye. When
right.
you think about a visual identity system, there are often style guides that go along with that
Sure.
that say, here's the four color representation of our logo. Sometimes you can't use all four colors. Here's the grayscale,
Right,
in a black and white
right,
situation. Here's our typography. Here's our font. Here's how you can use our logo and adapt it in certain
right,
situations. Here's how, for consistency's sake, you should never have the logo appear this way or adapt it this way.
right.
And what that does is it gives you standards for adoption across a wide series of contexts, but it also keeps the consistency in place,
hmm
which is really important to help us recognize things because we
hmm
see it over and over again the same way we have the association. So, all we're talking about in sonic identity is doing the exact same thing. You have multiple assets, you build the assets to be extremely flexible so that if one communication you need a lot more arousal, you've got that. If another communication during COVID, you want to soften things a little bit, you can do that, but you still have the recognizable
Yeah.
elements that are there. And I think that's really important that brands really understand that it's about developing a sonic identity system and using that in a consistent way, as opposed to just, oh, let me get a sonic logo and
Right.
that's everything.
Yeah, there's so I live in Silicon Beach. I'm in LA, but so I'm surrounded by I'm in El Segundo, which is like the creative frickin' world of LA now.
Hmm.
Done 22 years. I can't figure it out why it suddenly became that. But uh, I will meet people, and they're maybe startups, and they're successful, and I will say, so what do you sound like? And they look at me because I don't want to say that they're young is why they look at me that way, but they do. They look at me like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? What do we sound like? Right? Well, what does your brand sound like? One's a transportation company, another one might be, I don't know, a new drink they've come up with, right? Because everybody's always coming up with new drinks. But there's a lot of them around, and nobody can ever answer that question. Well, why do I need to know that? Uh, right? And then I'll explain it to them. It's not like I'm not there pitching them. I'm just there trying to expand their
Sure.
viewpoint on their marketing and their advertising and
Hmm.
how you have to one should as I started talking about because I'm a really big advocate, Steve, of it's great for like Studio Resonate. I'm sure you guys are working with large, prominent brands, and they
Hmm.
have the budgets and they can do all of these things. But there is a large sector of the population out there that are reinventing themselves. They're now
Right.
forced into, you know, this entrepreneurship or just finding a way to survive. So there are, and I'm trying every once in a while to talk a little bit about when you're creating your marketing materials. You have to do that when you're creating the idea for your new launch of your new brand, of your personal brand, whatever it is. I don't care. Start thinking about what it sounds like first for me. And then you start to develop all of your marketing assets kind of around this cadence, this feeling, you know, what it is. You know, are you a strong brand? Or you, you know, are you teaching how to get over your anxiety and you want to be
Hmm.
calm and and you speak to the angels, you know, whatever it might be. But
Right.
start to think about that first and explore what it's going to cost you to launch that properly. And then that also probably will determine what you do because, you know, um, and that sound is such an important part of it. And then I also tell people, especially podcasters, that, you know, um, think about sound design a little bit
Hmm.
to make your podcasts stand out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, what you're speaking to is just branding in general.
Yeah,
And I do think, a mistake that a lot of uh, tech companies and startups make is that they're so focused on the product,
yeah,
and they see the product as the brand or the
yeah,
service as the brand, rather than really seeing that brand identity and brand image in a way
right.
is much larger than just the product or the service. But to be fair, there's a way in which all brands, uh, as we were saying before, they're not thinking as intentionally about sound. And I think the reality is that there are very few, and I'd have to really think hard to come up with some brands that I would say are mute brands. In other words, brands that just don't operate in any context where there's sound. Most brands are already using a voiceover. They already have maybe some kind of sound design. Maybe they're licensing some music. And to your
Mhm.
point, these aren't, brands that are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, but even smaller brands that are
Yeah,
showing up on social media
right,
or maybe doing something with local radio.
right.
And so the reality is, for most brands, when we talk about sonic branding, they're already doing it,
Yes,
whether they realize it or not.
yes.
And that's the problem, is they're doing it without intention. So, they're not thinking about consistency. They may be thinking about that visually, but if I use the illustration of, getting to know each other with our voice. And the more time we spend together, the more we learn what our voice sounds like. The next conversation we have, you recognize my voice a little bit more. At some point, you get to know me so well that if I shout your name from across the street, you don't even have to turn around. Oh, that's Steve. And you can start to tell whether Steve's excited, whether he's sad, whether he's happy, whether he's agitated,
Oh, I love
you
that.
know,
Yeah,
and what most brands do is every campaign or every communication, they change their voice. They use a different voiceover. They use a
yeah,
different piece of music.
yeah,
They don't
yeah.
think about any through lines. And so think about that in terms of that illustration of getting to know each other by our voices. If the next time we talk to each other, I had a totally different voice. I spoke with a different accent. My voice was in a totally different pitch,
It
another
would be weird.
register. It would be weird. And then you talk to me the next time, and it's yet again, it's entirely different.
Yeah,
So you would respond to that with it being, well, I don't quite trust this guy, or
yeah,
where's he coming from? And so, that's an exaggerated metaphor, but in a very real way, brands that don't operate with any intention sonically, at a certain, more implicit level, they're not building recognition, they're not building trust, they're building incongruence, and in the long run, that will hurt you. And I don't care whether your budget is 15,000 for an entire year versus 15 million for an entire year. If you're using sound at all, you can have a strategy, and you
Yes.
can make a strategy
Yes.
work with a budget,
Yes.
but the strategy is key.
Yes. And often having that strategy and work, often you can make it work on a very small budget. I mean,
Yes.
if you write it all down and you know kind of what you want and you go out there, you can get a sonic logo, you can get maybe your intro or your outro, or you can get that done, and then you just reuse them, you repurpose them. It's audio.
Right.
It's just an audio file. It is not, and you can put it wherever you want to put it.
Yeah.
It is
As,
not as expensive as people
yeah.
think.
As
Right.
long as you own the copyright. So that's my
Exactly.
little caveat
Yeah.
is that if you're going to build a sonic identity,
Yeah.
don't build it on a property you have to license.
Right.
Build it on a property you can own,
Right.
because you want to be able to use it whenever, wherever, however you want, and controlling the copyright is really important.
Exactly. And then there's also, I'm glad you brought that up. So back in the day, when I first started to understand, I did a long form for Time Life. It was all based around the Time Life Library of Music. It was a fitness infomercial, right? And the promise from Time Life was, this is awesome. We'll just use the library of music and we'll sell that in the fitness dance videos, right? Okay. Well, they never got the rights from the music
Hmm.
side of it. And so we had to compose. We had already shot the footage, right? We
Right.
shot it and now we were going to. And so we had to compose all of the music that we sold,
Hmm.
right? And all of the music that was also uh, in the show, in the long form.
Hmm.
People dancing to it, right? So you got somebody dancing to Pink or whatever, and then we had to compose that. But anyway, that was a bit of a nightmare. So I learned a lot about composing to picture, and then just basically composing and doing all of that stuff. But the one thing that I learned many years ago was you also want to have the publishing rights. You can set up a publishing company and have the publishing rights,
Yes.
correct? Because
Yeah.
whoever is composing is going to want the writers.
Yeah.
No?
Although in the U.S., and this is a bit of a tangent, but copyright law in the U.S. is different than copyright law internationally. If it's a work for hire, because corporations in the U.S. are people too, the corporation can be the composer. So as a work for hire,
Oh, I
technically
see.
technically the brand or whoever commissions it owns everything. They can put themselves down as the
Hmm.
writer. But to your point, there's in any music composition, there are two sets of rights. One is, as you mentioned, the publishing, which
Hmm.
covers the composition, the
Hmm.
melody, the way it's structured.
Right,
Then there's the rights for the master recording,
right.
for the recording itself.
Yeah.
So you want to own both rights, and if you own the publishing rights, then you can commission another recording. You can have it done in a different style, a different genre, with different instrumentation. You don't have to pay anything for that. You own those rights. You will have to pay someone to make a new master, but again, you pay them for that. You own the rights for that if you structure it that way. Um, I will very often, though, encourage brands to allow writers to keep the writer's
Yeah.
share,
Yeah.
simply because I think that's good form.
Exactly.
It also means that the talent that's creating for you knows that you're thinking about them,
Yeah.
and very often
Yeah.
means you can then get more people to work for you because they know they're going to treat them fairly. But at the end of the day, uh, you want to, at the very least, own the publishing and the master rights, even if the writer keeps their share of the publishing.
And this is and this is nothing for people listening. This is nothing new. It's not like you're going
No.
to be asking people, do me a favor. I heard on a podcast that this is what I should really do.
Yeah.
No, this is pretty typical.
Yeah.
This
It's
is what
just
should be done.
most people don't think about this. Larger brands do. the really big brands have set up publishing companies for themselves. McDonald's certainly has one.
Sure,
Every piece of
sure.
music that they have recorded goes into a library that
Yeah,
can be used,
yeah.
and they monetize that. You can collect
You can
royalties
collect
on
royalties.
on
Yeah.
this usage, but again, that's a whole other podcast in of
Well, that's
itself.
another podcast, but also in advertising, you never know, like in direct response, when I was doing long form infomercials, you never knew which one was going to air for 10 years, right?
Right.
And so that was a big source of
Hmm.
income for whoever had the publishing and the
Right.
master rights. So
Exactly.
that's why I know about that. But often it really enhances anything that you're doing if you have your sound design and music scored to picture. That so there's I love what you do, by the way. I know that you have to go. I love sound design. I love to produce. I love being a creative, and I think that sound design, especially, I think I met you because you were on Carrie Roberts' show and we were talking about sound
Right.
design for Voice
Yeah.
First World.
Hmm.
From my creative agency side, I thought, well, that's a really great place to get into as I'm older. I'm 65, using all of my skills, marketing, advertising, and producing. That would be a great place to go and help people with their creative, right?
Hmm.
Their and voice. Um, and that gets a little tricky. That's a whole nother podcast because that does get it's not a little tricky doing the work at all.
Right.
It's it's working on the creative side of that. There's so much tech stuff going on, and it's
Yeah.
it's so techy, and always changing.
Yeah.
And I was interviewing somebody because I started off with this whole flash briefing thing, and I thought, well, that's awesome, and it's free media, and if you have a really cool skill design, that's really cool, and blah blah blah, right? And then I was interviewing somebody who had just written a book, and it's coming out in October, about Amazon and being an Amazon seller, which I'm also an Amazon seller because I have a different product, so I know a lot about Amazon. And I said, Rick, do you know what a flash briefing is? And he looked at me, he said, no. And then I said, do you know what a skill is, an Alexa skill is? And he said, no. I said, you're writing a book about Amazon and you don't know what these are? And that like put the light on for me. Until there's more adoption, it's like, I'm not really gonna waste my time over there. I love the creative part of, so I'm focused more on helping people really understand that your sound design and your creativity and your storytelling in your podcasting is what is going to make you, you know,
Right.
that's a differentiator that you should be focusing on.
But I think, to your point, and to some of the discussion we've had earlier about thinking about sound as a system, the things that you're developing for use in your podcast, particularly if they're built around, developing a sonic identity, are easily taken and translated into an Alexa skill, or
Yes,
something
absolutely.
for Google Play or Apple Home.
Yes.
And so, I think, again, that's the other thing to realize, is that just as you are building a visual identity, and maybe you don't have letterhead yet,
Right.
but maybe
Right.
you will. Maybe you don't have a business card yet. Maybe you just have a
Yeah.
website. But
Yeah.
as you get into these different mediums and different places that you can show up visually, you
You
use
should be
these
there.
elements there.
Yes.
Same way with
Yeah.
sound.
Yeah.
So what are the consumer touch points that are part of the brand experience, because that's what you're creating.
I'm 1000% with you on that. That's why I was jumping in on it.
Yeah.
It's be in the Amazon ecosystem. This is where people are shopping. I have a whole thing that I want to do called a podcast, right? Where you can put your podcast into a flash briefing, build out the skill,
Hmm.
which is what I'm doing tomorrow for my 5 minute that I have, right? I'm taking it from a flash briefing and I'm going, okay, hey, there's all this other stuff that
Right.
you can have. So, yes, I love that part of it, but most people, I'm still there, but making
Right.
a living helping people do their creative for their voice first penetration into basically flash briefings on Amazon, that's not there yet because there's no adoption, and you have to have consumer adoption in order for 100 million billion Echo devices that are out there, and
Hmm.
Amazon doesn't ever even do like a commercial that says, hey, 100 million billion people who own these devices, did you know Yeah, I want to turn it into, if you see a commercial on television, I want there to be like a little as Ask Alexa logo in the commercial, so all people know automatically that they just have to ask Alexa to buy that product on
Yeah,
television.
yeah.
That's where we should be going with that, right?
Well, and some brands are doing that. Some brands are thinking ahead that far. We're seeing the rise in adoption of smart speakers. It's one of the things that's driven the
Mhm.
conversation around sonic identity, because brands now are realizing, oh, here's this whole world where the shelf is digital. We spend all this time and money on developing packaging that stands out when people look at the
That's
shelf.
right.
What's our digital packaging?
Right.
What are the things sonically that differentiate us? Because otherwise, what will happen? People will order from Alexa, but if there's nothing that draws them to your brand, there's also nothing that prohibits them from going with whatever the Amazon brand is for that particular
That's right.
product.
That's right. That's
Um,
right. And that's where the complexity of the technology comes in, understanding the development side of the briefings, of the skills, and it's really up to the brand to make sure you have a kick-ass one. And so you are able to order a product through it. There's just certain restrictions there. It's not that easy. It's great if you just want to be in somebody's ear with a flash briefing for five
mhm,
minutes. That's awesome. That's what I do. I entertain for 5 minutes and I say, hey, here I am. I need to build that into something more
right.
just for me to test that out
Mhm.
also. And then, so it does technically get a little messed up. And then it's always changing. It is changing every week,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know?
and like I said, it's getting better, and to a point that
Yes,
we chatted about earlier. You've got a generation that's raised, learning that they don't have to text; they can just speak,
I
and
hope
so
so.
they're
I hope so.
so they're developing these skills right away, where they're simply talking to the device is talking back, and I think more and more we're going to see that adoption. And then we kind of get into, to me, what are the really interesting applications of voice technology, which goes way beyond just ordering a product.
Oh, yes, for
but
sure.
you know but
For
then we get
sure.
into how it works with us, how it might be able to pick up stress cues in our
Yes.
voice, how it might adapt environments in our home, from a
Security.
sensory perspective,
Hmm.
security, all those things. And then we start getting into interesting things around AI and
Yeah.
voice, which again, we've probably developed ideas for the next 10 podcasts for you today, because there's so
Right
much to
on.
talk about.
And that's what's so cool about it. And it's not often, and I'll let you let you go, but it's not often that I get to actually be really passionate and talk about something that I'm passionate about. We're all kind of scrambling and looking for things to talk about, and a lot of times, I have people on this podcast where I'm frankly, honestly, I'm not that interested. I'm not. I need to talk about things that I'm passionate and interested in. And then, I actually feel more fulfilled rather than, okay, you're listening to my podcast and you're listening to somebody that I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to make a story out of this interview because it's not was not that interesting to me. Sorry. And can I be really real about that? Can I be authentic about that? Am I being a bitch or whatever? But it's all very important to me. So I love what you do. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show, Steve Keller. And, let's stay in touch if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for inviting me. As you can tell, I'm passionate about the
I
subject.
know.
So
I know.
I'm always learning. I'm forever a student. So there's
Yeah.
always new things I'm looking at, new things I'm researching. And these conversations are good because I'm also learning at the same time.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
appreciate all of that. So
thank
thank
you.
you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. It was a real joy. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you.
Okay. And Steve, thank you so much. That was
You're
awesome.
welcome. And that was good timing, because I also have a bunch of workmen I'm in a tall apartment complex, and they're repainting the outsides.
Oh
So the
God.
scaffolding just moved down.
Yeah.
right outside this glass door where I am. So we
It's
got
been a
through
total
without them.
nightmare. Yeah,
So,
for me. We got
well,
through
like I
it
say,
without
it's
the
just a
no.
part of COVID.
I'm sorry, but I really, because I think this video is going to be nice, so I might put up this whole video, which I usually don't do, right? But I think we had a flowing conversation, so it was kind of cool.
Yeah,
But anyway, I hear them. I
yeah.
hear them.
Yeah, near the end of our conversation, I threw up the mute while you were talking,
Oh,
just
did
so they
you?
wouldn't be, yeah, just so they
Okay.
wouldn't be in the background.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. I'll let you know when this is going to be posted. Okay.
Great. All
All
right.
right.
Well,
Thanks, Steve.
thanks, Wendy. Stay
All right.
safe. We'll
All
talk to
right.
you later.
Bye.
Bye bye.